In this video, we're going to take a look at Sailor Bungubox Cherry Blossom. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a soft or a gentle red on the page. Now, it does have quite a bit of tone variation that you can get depending on the pen, and it does shade quite a bit while writing. Now, shading is something that I generally don't care for in red inks, but I do think it's doing a really good job of it here. It doesn't mean that this is an ink that I'm going to say, yes, I want it, but I do think it's doing a very good job at it here. The main thing that really stands out to me as my issue with this ink in why I would not want a bottle of it is I use a lot of toned papers in my writing. I enjoy cream paper. And with that, I find that on toned paper, this red turns really a kind of peachy tone. And that bothers me to think that I'm writing with red, but it looks peach. Now, it's a pleasant enough peach tone, but if you're expecting a red and it turns peach, then that might be its own problem. And depending on what you are doing while you're writing, it could be another problem. Also, the peachy tone tends to look quite a bit lighter, a little more washed out, and so it's dulled a bit by it. So that turns to another problem for me because I don't want this to be a dull color. I don't mind it being so gentle when it's a red, but as the peach, it just loses something and doesn't look as pleasant on the page. But on white paper, it really is going to be good. You're going to see that a lot, and it looks really nice on the Clairfontaine. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pen BBS 456 with a 1.5 stub. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get a decent amount of shading. Considering this. Now, it's a drier fine, which is one of the reasons that its tone is a bit lighter, and its shading shows up really nice with this. While the tone is lighter, it is still certainly a nice, gentle red, and I can appreciate that. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It is shading fairly well, really quite well, but because it's much more red and darker here, I'm not enjoying the shading nearly as much in this case. The stub nib is got no feather, it has no spread, it does shade very well, and the comparison between this and the medium, for some reason I like it more here, even though it's about the same tone as the medium, and it shades about as well as the medium, but I think it looks a little bit nicer in its presentation. So while there may be preferences away from shading in general for red, and while there may be preferences in general for the much darker tones in red, sometimes an ink can show itself to perform in a way you like, regardless of preference. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Kaweco Brass Sport with a fine nib, a Pelikan P200 with a medium nib, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. Its tone, it still is actually holding on to being a red here, which is nice, and this is largely the case that it happened. Now I have a toned Tomoe River notebook that I'm using to take notes in, and I get a peachy tone there, and we're going to see kind of a peachy tone in a little bit. But it's doing very well here at staying red. The fine has no feather, it has no spread, it has a little bit of shading. Not tons, but a little bit, but I still think this looks fairly good. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It has no feather, it has no spread. There are a few moments of shading. I would prefer this one, I think, in its more solid dark tone with how it's looking here than to have the shading show up. The stub nib is about as dark as the medium, maybe a hair lighter. It has no feather, it has no spread, it has no shading. It is a good, solid, performing red here, which is nice. It's very nice in how it's doing. Looking at the back of the page, we get a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleed through. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, the first thing for me, and I'm not sure how well it's going to come through on camera, but to the eye, I see a lot of the peachy tone and it turns redder in some of the shaded areas. Now with that, it has no feather, it has no spread, and yes, it does shade, but it shades from peach to red, which is kind of weird looking to me, and I don't like how that looks on this paper. The medium nib is much darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. Yes, it shades fairly well. You see it in the word bodies very much. You see it in mouth very much. In other words, it's much darker. So it's a mix here, and that mix I'm not going for. Yeah. The stub nib is about the same tone as the medium. It has some very light feathers that are going to occur on a couple of the words, not all of the words. It's not really constant, but it is definitely there. You see it on realm in the second line. You see it on the LD of wood in the second line. Just a few spots, a very tiny feathering, but it does occur. It doesn't have any spread. It does shade. I don't like how it looks on this paper shading. just darker red shading. Don't do it for me. Looking at the back of the page, we have a minimal amount of ghosting and we get no bleeding. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we do get a little bit of shading. As we would expect with this paper, we do get it to look a little more washed out as a color, a little lighter, though I think it maintains being red. I think it does well, and it is a gentle red here that's not screaming for something to look at. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. It has no spread. It does shade. It's lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine white paper. It's lighter than we had on the toned papers before. But it is still performing fairly well as a red if you like the shading that you're getting. The stub nib is about the same tone as the medium, maybe a little darker more frequently. It gives you the darker tones more frequently than the medium did. It has, no feather, no spread. It is shading. It's just a red to me here. This paper does have a tendency to really mute inks in that way. Looking at the back of the page, we have a normal amount of ghosting and no bleeding. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Diamine Blood Orange. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Garnet Red. Here is Mont Blanc Leonardo da Vinci. Here is Robert Oster Astrakiza Rot. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread, we get a couple of light moments of shading. It's okay. This isn't really for me in how this is looking on this paper. It's just one of those where you have to have all three right, and these are just off a little bit for me. Not that there's anything wrong with them, just not for me. The medium nib is much darker than the fine. It does have tiny feathers that are occurring in any of the darker areas, so spoiler there. So it has the feathering. It has almost no spread, and any spread that appears has to do with the feathering. It does have a little bit of shading that shows up, but again with the feathering. So when you look at had, the very first word, you see tiny feathers on the D. You see planned, and on the P, L, and D, tiny feathers, all where it's darker. The broad nib has no feather. It has no spread. It has some shading. It is just there. I think I've been calling this a stub nib on the bottom. The bottom is, in fact, a broad, not a stub, thinking of the daily pen. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting, and we had no bleed through that touched the page underneath. While it's nice to compare it to other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a black ink by Kaweco, Pearl Black. Here's a turquoise ink by Pelikan, their 4001 turquoise. Here's a green ink by Schaefer, their green. Here's a blue-black ink by Schaefer, blue-black. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Fairly predictable performance at this point. We have a tiny bit of feathering only in a few spots. The dryer fine is really helping to control the feathering. It's also helping to control and keep the spreading down to a minimum, although it does have some tiny feathers and tiny spread. It does have a couple of moments, just a handful of moments in these 3 lines where it will shade a tiny bit, but not very much. The medium is much darker than the fine. It has no feather. Nope, sorry, it has some feather. Looking at the word keep and the word him, you see tiny feathers all over it, but I didn't see feathering in would or busy. I see it in than and a, but not few. So it's intermittent and not really predictable when the feathering is going to occur. There is a little bit of spread, although I think it's manageable, and there is no shading. Looking at the broad nib, there is feather, there is spread. It's not my favorite in how it's looking here at all. I want to say there's 1 or 2 moments that look a little bit different in tone, so maybe there's shading, but I'm really going to say there's no shading. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleed through that came and touched the page underneath. Now we do get a normal amount of ghosting, but you see this ink was not aggressive getting deep into the paper at all. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? So this is an ink that had some odd performance for me, because even though shading isn't for me with red inks, I tend to like their darker, no shading look. I like the darker look with this ink with some of its shading that I got with the broad. Now, I enjoyed it also in my daily writer with a 1.5 stub, and I enjoyed it from the dry fine nib where it was lighter and shaded very well. So this ink, I think, has a few features about it that look really nice on the right paper that get me to like some stuff about this ink that I normally don't care for in reds. So the quick recap is I really think this looks good from a wet stub or a dry fine. Thanks for watching.